So first of all, let me say that we are really pleased to host you and so many other renowned, let's say, scholars in the area of multilingualism and bilingualism, also Professor Bialystok, for example, Professor Kaiser, and so on. So we are really, really honored and really pleased to have this opportunity, and also the online tools enable us to have this. It's really incredible, this part. Really, we have to thank also the people who have developed these tools, that they enabled us to do it. And so today's presentation, Professor Ludovica Serratrice, it's the way it's pronounced, this name. The presentation is Input Matters, the role of language exposure in bilingual children's vocabulary, grammar, and comprehension skills. Professor Serratrice is a professor of multilingualism and bilingualism at the University of Reading. I think it's a good idea also to mention that you were the director of the Center for Literacy and Multilingualism for 3 years, and you are also a member of the Reading branch of Bilingualism Matters, which I think is quite an interesting research and information center at the University of Edinburgh. And I can see that it has a nice, really good circle of researchers working on bilingualism and language learning. The main areas, the main focus of your research, I think I can safely say it's mostly language development in multilingual, bilingual contexts. You've published also on discourse pragmatics, especially related to the use and acquisition of reference. And of course, I can see from your research, from your articles, that you have been cited a lot. I mean, a lot of citations, and really congratulations for that. I don't know how hard it is to get such a wide, let's say, following of other scholars. I can see, well, you come from Italy, so in a way you have an extra perspective on bilingual and multilingualism. So it's really important to say this for those people who maybe don't know that you are not just English. You are both, yeah, also Italian. I mean, you are a little bit English as well, I guess, today. But I think this is really an important, it's important to have also this connection with language through the languages we use. So I know that you've been involved in a number of projects, and as already mentioned, you've also published widely in the area of multilingualism and bilingualism. And a lot of your references have become referential, I could say, in bilingual language development. Especially looking at the latest publications, which I've read, the last few articles, I have to say that you're doing great research, really interesting, really up to date, and also especially interesting for our project. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say today, and I think everybody is. And after, of course, this first part, we're going to have a discussion, well, the Zoom is all yours.
Thank you very much, Silva and Tina, for inviting me and for this introduction. I'm really delighted to be here. As we were just saying a couple of minutes ago, I think, maybe this is just one good thing about this horrendous pandemic, that in some strange way has actually brought us closer together. And it's been, fantastic to go and to listen to people, to talk to people all over the world, to hear what they've got to say. So maybe what I can do, I'll just, I guess, start sharing my screen. But you need to give me permission, I think, because it says host disabled participant screen sharing. Somebody needs to either make me a co-host.
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's see.
Silva, you're the host now.
I'm the host. Oh, sorry. I didn't know that. Sorry. Here we go.
Let's see. Let's try again.
Sorry.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
It should work now. Right. I'm just gonna go. Sorry. Where's slideshow? Okay, slideshow. Sorry, I couldn't just see. Okay. All right. I think that's it. Right. So as Silva was saying, I'm going to talk tonight about the a couple of projects that I'm currently involved in, and they are all set in the UK. But some of them, one of them in particular that I'm going to talk about towards the end, is also set in a European context with colleagues in France and the Netherlands. So I'll just, let's see if I can go. Okay, like this. Okay, so I'm just very briefly, the outline is, why should we talk about input? Why use stories? So I'm going to talk about listening comprehension. So comprehension of spoken language, and also how do we bring different aspects of language development together? So vocabulary, grammar, inferences, they're all, of course, language is multidimensional, and therefore we need to understand different aspects of children's language knowledge and language development to understand them more holistically. I have to say that this is kind of bad bilingualism research because I'm actually only going to be talking.
Na to ti ješ se prijavim, ker si pol ure pišem. Hvala, si dobila kaj?
Sorry.
I think somebody's got a mic on, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, so this is bad bilingual research, because I think there are two ways of approaching bilingualism, right? So either you get a language combination that you can talk about, and I've done that in the past, looking at, say, for example, English-Italian bilingual children, Spanish-Italian, and so on and so forth. Or you're going, and this is what we've done in this case, we've gone into in several primary school classrooms, and we've just taken all of the children there who were bilingual to some extent. So this is, in a way, an ecologically valid way of doing research on bilingual children, but at the same time, it means that we could only look at their societal language, the language of schooling, which in our case is English, because as you will see, these children, for example, had 28 different languages, and there was just no way that we could also assess their language skills in their other languages. So this is a very partial picture of these children's bilingual development, but it's going to tell us something about the language of schooling, and perhaps this is something that might resonate with some of our colleagues here, and maybe like the context of Slovenia, I'm sure will be different, but there may be some parallels. All right, so this doesn't seem to work. Okay. So, well, first of all, why talk about input? I mean, this might sound obvious, but, I think most of us know that really language input is one of the strongest predictors of language development, okay, in both monolingual and bilingual children. And then measures of the input can explain vocabulary development, grammatical development in both monolingual and bilingual children. So there are, of course, different aspects of input that will have different type of effects on different aspects of language, as we'll see later. But this relationship, regardless of what kind of theoretical background come from, I don't think anybody would dispute that this is the case to some extent, right? And I think, talking about input in the context of bilingual children is theoretically interesting, because, the extent to which bilingual children, and of course, we all know that their language experience is divided across two languages, in a way, it makes this context an ideal test case to investigate how much input do you need to affect different aspects of language development to different extents. Okay, so in a way, you can kind of almost, it's kind of a natural experiment in the making. And then practically, and I don't know if some of the colleagues that we've got here tonight are teachers, as I believe that Tina and Silva told me, I think understanding from a practical point of view, the relationship between input and children's language skills and how they grow over time really also allows people, teachers and potentially speech and language therapists as well, and parents more broadly, to contextualize the expectation that they can have for whatever language achievement we can expect of these children on the basis of their language background. So I think it's important to have a very good picture of that. And then why stories, right? So I'm going to present some data that we've collected in the context of listening comprehension in narratives, because stories are everywhere, right? So in books, in personal narratives, in jokes, in accounts of, what we've done during the day. And obviously, when you listen to a story, you really need to make, to rely on different types of cognitive skills, of course, memory, attention, obviously language skills like vocabulary and grammar. And of course, we all know that strong oral language skills are also good predictor of children's reading comprehension, which in turn will affect academic success, right? Because, you know, children learn to read and then at some point they read to learn, right? This is the vehicle through which they acquire more knowledge. So that's important. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of context. I'll be very interested to know what your local context is. But at the moment, in England, I should say, because it's always very difficult. The UK is like a united kingdom in name only, I should say, because it's very divided actually when it comes to things like education and healthcare. So the English education system is quite different from the Scottish education system, the Northern Irish and the Welsh education system. So what I'm saying applies mostly really to the English context. So in England, you know, on average, sort of 20% of children in primary school classrooms have got English as an additional language, right? And so these are what are known as Eal Learners. And it's a very broad category. So here I've given the definition of the Department for Education. So these are all children whose first language is any language other than English that a child was exposed to during early development and continues, right? And their exposure to this language continues. So this is a very broad church of children, so to speak. Like I said, you know, so this is, you know, nationally 20%, but of course there are areas of, for example, in urban areas in London where these children make up the vast majority of children. So in a classroom, you may have like 80–90% of children who've got English as an additional language, so really high. And in other parts of the country, maybe, I don't know, 5%, maybe 1%. So it varies a lot. So this is, you know, very broadly speaking, but it changes. So, you know, a step backwards, again, just to sort of to say what I mean by listening comprehension, right? So I'm talking about oral language, but I'm talking about the text. And of course, you can talk about, you know, a written text, but also a spoken text. And of course, you know, when we're listening to a text, and in the context of listening comprehension can be anything from a personal narrative to a story to whatever, you need to create a mental representation of the meaning, right? And typically some of the mental representation of the meaning is based on the literal information that you get, but also you have to fill the gaps. So not everything in a text will be spelled out, will be explicit. You will need to sometimes make inferences. So make an informed guess about what the person that is speaking to you means when they say certain things, right? And both at the local level, so, you know, you might have to make some connections between things that this person has already said previously and connect them. For example, a very obvious case in when you use a pronoun like he or she, for example, you know, I could say, well, you know, I was talking to Tina earlier and she told me, right? So I don't repeat Tina, I say she. You have to make the connection that this pronoun she refers to somebody previously mentioned, Tina. But also you need to make some global inferences, okay? So basically connect your background knowledge of the world with what is being told in the text. And I will give some more examples about what I mean exactly later on. Basically, it's just to remind ourselves that when I talk about listening comprehension, I mean both the literal level of the text, but also the inferential level where you have to do a bit more of, you know, legwork to figure out what is being said. So as I was just saying, sort of local inferences could be an example. Various example is a pronoun. Here you've got two potential reference, John and Laura, but of course, because I'm using a feminine pronoun, it can only refer back to a feminine antecedent like Laura in this case. So you made that connection and you immediately know, if you know anything about gender and pronouns in English, that she refers to Laura and not to John. So I don't have to repeat Laura. Global inferences, like I said, you know, you have to rely on world knowledge. For example, if you're buying popcorn before sitting down to watch a film, you're probably not at home, but you're probably in a cinema, right? Because you wouldn't be buying popcorn in your own house before you see a film. So this is just to give you a little bit of context to explain what we try to do. So we had 3 basic research questions and in this study. So first of all, we wanted to see how the amount of input, or the English input, because we're only testing English for the reason that I explained earlier, how the amount of English would predict that this measure of input that we took at the beginning of a study, this is a longitudinal study, how this would predict children's vocabulary and grammar over time. Okay, and like I said, this is also a little bit just an aside that I wanted to make, and I'm as guilty as any other child development researcher in the field. We often talk about language development, but very rarely do we do longitudinal studies. Okay, a lot of the time we take snippets and we say, okay, children at age 5 do this. If we're lucky, maybe we have a cross-sectional study where we've got, children aged 5, children aged 7, aged 9, 3, whatever. So we've got groups of children at different ages, and we get a snapshot of what children may do at that age. But very rarely do we follow the same group of children over time. There are good reasons why that doesn't happen very often. The most obvious, that it's time consuming because you have to wait for these children to grow. And the other one, time obviously equals money and resources. So unfortunately, we don't have as many longitudinal studies as we would like to really inform our sense of development over time, right, in the same individuals. So I was quite lucky that in this case, we were able to do this. This is over the course of 12 months. So it's not a very long longitudinal study, but still, long enough so that we could test children at 3 time points, as I will show later. Then the other second important question was, so we took a series of measures that I'll explain in more detail in a minute. We wanted to see how a certain set of foundation cognitive and language skills would predict these higher order comprehension skills, right? So if we measure things like memory, attention, vocabulary, and grammar, can we make a prediction of which ones are going to be more informative in predicting how well children will do in this assessment of language comprehension? And obviously, this third question, which informed the whole project, which was, how does the English input come into this? Because these are children, as you will see in a minute, that came, they start school with very, very different backgrounds. Some children were born in England, for example, and had parents that come from other countries and spoke languages other than English to them. So some children have got, maybe a language like Polish at home and, English in the community. Some children have got, maybe 2 or 3 different languages at home. Some children come to school basically monolingual in another language, although they were born in England. Some children are recent migrants. So they arrive, they've lived elsewhere, and then they arrive and they start school in England with very little English, okay? So you will see that our profile is really very varied, and it really reflects the kind of classrooms we've got when we're talking about multilingual classrooms. Okay, so this is basically, a bit of a snapshot of what we wanted to look at. So we've got listening comprehension, which is at the top, which really includes, apart from the understanding of literal information, really the inference making. Okay, so how good are these children at filling the gaps of things that are not explicitly said to them on the basis of skills, of cognitive skills like memory, attention, non-verbal inferencing. Okay, so how do you figure out what's going to happen when there is no language that tells you, what the cause and effect of something is, for example. Then, of course, all the obvious, the usual suspects, vocabulary, morphology and syntax, and comprehension monitoring. And I will give you examples of how we assessed these measures. And then we took a measure of cumulative English input, which is basically the children's language, experience of English over time. Okay, so we asked parents through a questionnaire how much English and how much of the child's other languages they were exposed to, not just at that point in time when we were assessing them, but also over the course of their life, which, as I said, for a recent migrant is very different as opposed to a child that was born in England, for example, and had some exposure to another language throughout the course of their lives. Okay, so So these are our children. So we had 100 Eal Learners, so children with English as an additional language. We had 9 schools in the south of England. As I was just mentioning to Silva a minute ago, and maybe not everybody heard, is that we deliberately decided to not have a monolingual control group, right? As is off, because we just decided, well, that it was time to look at bilingual, multilingual children in their own right. And we were a little bit apprehensive because we didn't know how reviewers of, journals would take it. And by the way, sorry, I just realized that I for some reason, the reference cut off. So we've now got a published paper and another one that we're very hoping that is very close to be published. I can put the reference for this if people are interested. It's a paper that is published in Cognitive Science. And like I said, we were quite apprehensive because we weren't quite sure what the reviewers were going to say. But what do monolingual children do, right? And I think we were really pleased that none of the 6 reviewers that we've had for these 2 papers said that, none of them, or the editor. So we were really pleased because also for me, I think this is also a sign that the field has moved forward from this monolingual mindset, that it's ready to say, okay, let's look at what bilinguals do. Because of course, when we're doing research on monolinguals, nobody ever asks you, what do bilinguals do, right? You just say, you talk about, I don't know, English monolingual children, Slovene monolingual children, Italian monolingual children. Nobody asks you like, what would like a Slovene Italian bilingual child do in this context, right? So I was very pleased, I have to say, a little bit surprised, but very pleased about that. Anyway, so like I said, so we so in England, children go to school at 4.5, so that's a reception year, and then they start year 1 when they're around 5. I said, 5.8 is the average. So some children are a bit younger, some children are a bit lower because of course, they can start school, when they start in September, they may be a little bit closer to their birthday, of course, as is always the case. So we basically follow them throughout the first year of primary school. And so the beginning of year 1, and then we tested them at the end of the school year. And then again at the beginning of the next school year. So we've got about, we've got 12 months in between the 2 time points. And because we had 3 time points, also we could do some sort of growth curve modeling, so we could see like the shape of the rate of development. As I mentioned earlier, we've got a lot of different languages. There were quite a lot of Polish children because in the southeast of England, there are pockets of, as is often the case, sometimes you've got communities that tend to cluster together. And as you can see, the cumulative exposure to English at time 1, i.e. when they started, primary school, the first year of primary school, varied widely. So as you can see, the range for it was 1 month. So these are children that have literally just arrived, okay, to 62 months. So these are children that have been exposed to English and another language pretty much from birth, right? So we've got like a beautiful, messy spectrum of all sorts of ranges of exposure. So this is what we asked children and their parents to do. So for parents, we asked them to complete a questionnaire where we asked them about relative amount of exposure to English and the home language. It is not the questionnaire that I'll be talking about later on, which is part of a current project because this data was collected 2 or 3 years ago. So we're not there yet with this other questionnaire. And then children were seen individually. These were still the days when you could go to schools and, see children in person rather than having to do this over Zoom or Teams. So we actually went to the schools. And these are the measures that we took. So all those foundational cognitive language skills and language skills, right? Cognitive and language. So we took like nonverbal cognition, this was a task where children had to assemble a puzzle, attention, they had to count tones and spot inconsistency in stories. If people are very interested, I can send them the paper if they want to find out about the exact test that we did, but just to give you a flavor for the kind of things. The memory, sort of digit, sort of repeated numbers forwards and backwards. And then we're actually very glad, mostly when people talk about vocabulary, when they assess vocabulary, they look at vocabulary size, right? So how many words do children know? Which is one measure of lexical knowledge, so vocabulary breadth, okay? So how many words they know. But another measure, and we were really, really glad that we looked at this additional vocabulary measure, is vocabulary depth. Okay, so how deep are the connections between the words the children do know? I'm not going to say very much about vocabulary depth just now, because I'm going to talk about it quite a bit later on. Okay, so but it's a different aspect of vocabulary, a different dimension. And then grammar, so morphology and syntax. So again, this may be sort of very familiar to people, so I will skip over this if that's, so this is, for example, one way in which you can look at morphology. So this is one subtest of the CELF, which is the Clinical Evaluation of Language Fundamentals, which is a test that is widely used in Britain and also in the States. So, you know, the usual, it sounds like a WUG test, but actually these are real words, right? So, you know, here is one book, here are two books, you know, here's one horse, here are two horses, right? Okay, so looking at plural. And then again, you know, there were different aspects of morphology, things like past tense, pronouns, you know, various aspects of inflectional and derivational morphology as well. Then we had like more like a syntactic comprehension test. So this is the test for reception of grammar, the TROG. So children hear a sentence, they've got 4 pictures and they have to point to the correct picture. Okay, so this is a passive construction and they have to point to the one that corresponds to the sentence that they hear. And then this is, you know, the British Picture Vocabulary Scales, which is very similar to the Peabody vocabulary test, where children hear a word, and there are 4 words, and then, sorry, 4 pictures, and they have to match, you know, the correct. And here you see like a semantic distractor. You've got the apple and you've got a pear, which is obviously in the same ballpark, but obviously clearly not the same thing. And this is the one of, I should say, we had another one, measure of vocabulary depth. So children were given a word, and then they had 3 other words. And then we asked them which one of these 3 words was either similar or, you know, the opposite of. So you hear a word like ill, and then you hear dirty, sick, tired. Which one is a synonym for ill? So clearly sick in this case. And then you've got, you know, a word like bad. What's opposite of bad? Pretty, good, or slow. So obviously good in this case, right? So there were obviously several of these, and children had to find, you know, the right synonym or the right antonym, i.e. the right opposite word. Then we did this other test, which is, I wanted to play an audio and actually test you in the audience, but then decided against it, because oftentimes when you're doing these things over Zoom and Teams, you can't hear the audio. So I just thought, rather, you know, to avoid technical issues, I'm just going to show you what the stories were. So this is what they looked like. So children were given a series, I think there were 12 stories, and 12 were consistent and 12 were inconsistent, and they were like, you know, randomized. So sometimes, you know, so they didn't have a block of consistent and inconsistent, but they had mini stories like this, and they were said, you know, they were told, you're going to hear a little story, and then some of these stories are a little bit strange. So tell me, you know, if the story makes sense or if there is something odd, right? So in no inconsistency story, you know, James had a cat called Sammy. He really liked taking care of his pet. And then you've got a third sentence. James loved his cat, Sammy, very much. Okay, this is a mini story about, you know, James and his cat, Sammy. That was totally fine. What about the other one? You know, Jack had a dog called Rocky. He really liked playing with his pet so far. And then here you said Jack loved his cat, Rocky, very much. So here you're thinking, well, no, wait a minute. It wasn't a cat, it was a dog, right? But you can only spot this inconsistency if you paid attention, right? If you're monitoring your comprehension. And this is also how we often get misunderstandings, even, you know, with, you know, us as adults, with other adults, because we're not paying attention, we're not monitoring, you know, and whether we are, you know, what we're listening to is what we're going to remember 2 sentences down the line, right? So in fact, we actually tested this, we piloted this with some undergraduate students, I should say, and sometimes the undergraduate students weren't spotting the inconsistency because they were not paying attention, okay? So this happens. And then, you know, so these were all our predictors, okay? So these various measures and our outcome. So the thing that we wanted to, you know, find out about was listening comprehension. So we had a standardized measure, which is the understanding spoken paragraphs, again from the CEL-4, which is the clinical evaluation of language fundamentals, and it's a story. And then you've got children hear the story, and then they're asked a few questions. Those kind of questions that tap into literal understanding and then inferential understanding. So can children fill the gaps, right, if the information is not explicitly provided in the text? But then we also created bespoke stories, right? So where we manipulated the kind of literal information, local and global, that we asked the children. So I'm going to show you here. So this was, just an example of a story. It says it was a special day at school. I have a surprise for the children today, said Mrs. Smith to Joe's mom. She entered the class with a basket. All the children looked at the teacher. A loud meow came from the basket. Okay, so this is the first half of the story. And these were the kind of questions that we had. So first, a literal question. What did Mrs. Smith say to Joe's mom? So they just have to remember that Mrs. Smith said, I have a surprise for the children today, right? So literally just memory and attention. Then who do you think Mrs. Smith is? Anyone? Who do you think? It doesn't say who Mrs. Smith is. What's your inference? Does anyone want to make an inference?
The teacher?
Yes, right. Probably a teacher. And another inference, what was in the basket, do you think?
Oh, that's a meow, a cat, yeah.
A cat, right, okay. So these are things that you can see, right? It doesn't say anywhere these things, but you can infer, right? Because you know that cats meow. And then if somebody, is at school, is probably a teacher if it's another adult. And then again, it carries on. And just to give you an example, so we've got, a furry animal jumped out of the basket. We never say it's a cat. This is Fluffy, said the teacher. She will stay with us today. At lunchtime, the children gave Fluffy something to drink. They poured milk in a bowl. After lunch, the bowl was empty, right? So, and then we ask again another general question. Why was the bowl empty after lunch? Well, because normally you drink at lunch. And then the blue ones are local inferences. Okay, so here actually to answer that question, you really have to connect bits in the text. So it's quite a different type of inference. What did they give them to drink? And they say, and in the next sentence they say that they poured milk. It never said they gave the cat milk to drink, but you can make that local inference. And then again, the other inference that you can make is Fluffy a boy cat or a girl cat? Well, the teacher says she. So you can, again, make this local inference that it's a girl cat. Okay, so these are the kind of things, bearing in mind that these were like 5-year-olds. So this is the level of stories that we had for them. Okay, so what did we find? Just a reminder of the questions that we had at the beginning, the prediction of, how English input predicts vocabulary and grammar, how the amount of the current amount of English input sort of predict. This is what we found. So that over time, so when we're looking at vocabulary and grammar, we found something a little bit different. So the current amount of English input that we measured at the start of the study predicted how children did in vocabulary scores, both how many words they knew and how well connected they were. But when it came to morphology and syntax, and also in this case, also in the number of words, it was how long they had been exposed to English that really mattered. Okay. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense, right? Because, you can do relatively fast mapping when it comes to learn a new words, but it really takes a long time to acquire a construction like a passive, right? Or understand, or learn that the past tense of, in English is formed by mostly adding ed to a verb. So, length of exposure, how long the children had to familiarize themselves with these constructions was predictive of how well they did when it came to grammar as opposed to vocabulary. And also, I have to say that over the course of a year, and I don't know, maybe it'd be very interesting to know in the Q&A session later on, and I may be asking you questions, because I'm interested to know sort of, what the situation is, because we find that also input at school, especially in the early stage, is quite a leveler. So that, children, at least at school, they're all getting the same kind of input. So to some extent, especially when you're testing them in school-related activities and vocabulary, children, in a way, are, I mean, I'm not saying that there are not differences, obviously, but still, they're kind of brought down a little bit in that respect by the fact that they're all exposed to similar input when they're in school. So for the second question is, we wanted to know how these, attention and memory, vocabulary and grammatical knowledge predicted comprehension over time. Okay, so remember that we tested children at the end. So we wanted to know, when we test them at time 1, what can we predict in terms of listening comprehension at time 3, right? And then, so we put all the, so, when we did like a regression type of analysis, and normally, before putting predictors in a regression, you're doing bivariate correlation. So you just take, I don't know, how does vocabulary, how is vocabulary breadth, for example, correlated with listening comprehension? How is morphological knowledge correlated with listening comprehension? If they're significantly and positively correlated, you put them in a regression, right? And then when you've got this model, you want to see, when you put everything together, what still remains as a significant or as a really useful predictor when you've controlled for everything else. And so this is what we found, that basically the two strongest and significant predictors were vocabulary depth and morphological knowledge. Okay, so vocabulary depth is, this measure of connectedness, if you like, of words to other words. Morphological knowledge, and again, is basically finding out how morphology, inflectional morphologies, like, for example, past tense or plurals, or derivational morphology, how to make, for example, an adverb out of an adjective. Okay, morphological awareness is a great predictor, for example, of reading comprehension, because once you crack this kind of code, you can make, you can make a noun out of an adjective, for example, or make a noun out of a verb, or at least in English, it's a very productive kind of linguistic device. So these were really, the things that allow children to make inferences, allow children to fill the gaps, because of course, the more your vocabulary is deep, it means you've got like lots of different connections. So I think I'm gonna have maybe this, yeah, okay. So this is, I've got like a good example. So this is sea otters, right? So if the child knows the word sea otters and they've got a deep understanding of what a sea otter is, they know things that, where the habitat of the sea otter, that they, live in water most of the time, that they like to deep dive for food, that they tend to, lie back and float on their back a lot. They like to sleep and, rock with the tide. They eat clams. They're very playful. They like to do, so all of these things. And then, what they look like a little bit. So all of these things, when you've got deep knowledge of these words, it also means that you know so much about it. And if you know about, the habitat of the sea otter, if they say something about where the sea otter lives and in the story, and it's not fully spelled out, you can enrich this kind of context, right? Because when you think sea otter, you immediately think, I don't know, river, or sea, or like, water, what kind of, type of animals will the sea otter likely to be. So this is like, very sketchy for just like one noun, but also you can see how obviously our mental lexicon then, there is a lot of overlap. And then when this is a noun, but if you're talking about a verb, for example, you will know whether a verb takes, I don't know, it's a transitive verb or an intransitive verb, what kind of constructions you're likely to find it in. So, and why this is important really, and this was, in a way, our take-home message to the teachers that we talked about our research is that many children start school, at least in England. I don't know if it's the same, in Slovenia, but without the broad and deep vocabulary that is really crucial to set them on a good path for listening and reading comprehension. And we know, and this is obviously, not in any way, their fault, so to speak, but bilingual children, because, right, some of these children had been in the country for a month. What do we expect? Of course, they've got vocabulary that are smaller and shallower, right? Because the fewer words the less likely you are to be making connection, because you don't have other words to make connection with. You need to get a critical mass of words before you can do that. But of course, we also know that, typically the size of bilingual learners, what they don't know in one language, they will know in the other. And then gradually, there will be a lot of words for which they've got translation equivalents in both languages, and some that only remain in one language and some that only remain in the other. All of us who are bilingual and multilingual here, I was asking Silva earlier, like, should I give this talk in Italian? She said, oh, no, I think, some people speak Italian, some people don't. And I actually thought, maybe actually I shouldn't give this talk in Italian, because my Italian vocabulary, when it comes to linguistics, is actually quite small. So it's quite shallow. So because I read everything in English, I write everything in English. So, even though Italian is my first language, I still, I'm an uneven bilingual when it comes to that. So it's completely normal that we should find the same situation for children. And again, this is something that may be, familiar to you already. I'm not sure. This notion of lexical quality, which is really connected to vocabulary depth. And I've just taken this table, which is, and again, I'm very happy, by the way, Silva, if people are interested, to give you the slides. I mean, I know this is recorded, but if people just want a copy of the slide, might be perhaps interesting. I don't know. Yeah, just sort of, how much, like a high quality, representation of a word will have well specified, children will know how to write the word, right? They will know the phonology, they will know the grammar, they will know what parts of speech it is. And of course, like I said, even if it's a verb, they will know how, whether, if it takes a past tense of some description. And of course, in languages, they're a bit morphologically richer than English, they will know a lot more than that. Then of course, obviously the meaning, but also, constituent binding, which kind of constituents you're likely to find in. So these are all the things that go together with knowing a word deeply, right? Rather than just doing, a quick, fast mapping. And then, so going back to then sort of this issue of amount of English and what role did it play, right? So we had input, and in one of our early analyses, we just used input as one of the predictors, okay? But actually, interestingly, it didn't come out significant at all. I'm just thinking, okay, this is strange, right? Because, all our issue was predicated, on input making a difference. So we're just thinking, this is not right. And the problem is that we just realized that our kind of modeling was not right. Because as you can see, so we did a different type of analysis, and we did it like, what's it called, a structural equation modeling, so some kind of mediation analysis, right? Where sometimes, where you see that something has an effect on something else, but indirectly, okay? So we found a direct and significant effect of input on the knowledge of children's morphology, on children's vocabulary depth. So how much English they had was directly and positively influencing, like I said, their knowledge of morphology, how deep their vocabulary was, and in turn that predicted how well they could do inferencing, right? So it's not, as straightforward like, input directed to listening comprehension, but it was mediated, okay? The effect of input is mediated by how much children how well, how deep their vocabulary was, and how strong their morphological knowledge. So in a way, so for example, if you want to improve children's inferential skills, maybe, the take-home message from something like this is not to drill them on, trying to make inferences, but actually to give children, a deeper vocabulary, to give children, expose them to a critical mass of input where they can enhance their morphological awareness and their morphological knowledge. including things like, we had pronouns, and those were the ones that were really relevant for making these local inferences, for example. And in the case of English, you have to learn number and gender and, case for pronouns, because we still have a little bit of that. But yeah, so these are the things. So, an intervention strategy wouldn't be, for a child who has comprehension difficulties, wouldn't necessarily be to go there and teach them how to make inferences, but probably work indirectly and working on vocabulary depth and morphological knowledge. And then you kind of get those kind of things for free, so to speak, right? Because it's a cascading effect that you get. So this brings us back to the issue that I was talking a little bit about earlier, or how you can get a good sense of the child's bilingual experience, right? So as we know, and again, I don't know if you've used any of these, there are lots of different types of questionnaires with many different ways of asking the same or the different questions, not always clear what metrics they use in terms of whether people, they're counting the number of hours that children are exposed to, whether these number of hours that they're exposed to, to one language as opposed to another are, for example, weighted, affected by the number of different speakers that use that language, whether these speakers are bilingual themselves. And then, of course, we all know, those of us who are bilingual, that, there is also a process of, language loss, language attrition, that again, although again, Italian is my first language, my Italian is not the way it was, 20 years ago before I moved to this country, even though I go back to Italy regularly, because I speak English all the time, my English is not like that of a monolingual speaker, but so is my Italian, neither is my Italian anymore. So what we did, we came together. So this is this project that I briefly mentioned at the beginning. This is the Cubex Project, bringing together, like I said, researchers from Reading, myself, Cecile Descartes from the University of Leeds, and then colleagues like Sharon Unsworth from Radboud Universities in the Netherlands, and Philippe Prévost and Laurie Thaler from the University of Tours in France. So we really came together. The first thing that we did is bring together teachers, speech and language therapy, and researchers who are interested in working on with multilingual children. I said, what do you do? What do you think we should be doing? So again, I think I had a bit of a problem with some references, and I don't know what I did in this presentation. I don't think they're there at the end, but again, if people are interested, they're on the website. We did a review of what things are available out there, and then we came together in what is known as a Delphi consensus, where we sat together and created a consensus on what should go, what we think should go in a questionnaire that is fit for purpose. So really what we wanted to do is establish a metric of the bilingual language experience that was shared among not just researchers but also practitioners, and to create something that is online, that it's as user-friendly as possible. And we always know that these questionnaires are too long, so one of the ways in which we've tried to accommodate for length and for what is relevant perhaps to a researchers but not to a teachers, and maybe relevant to a speech and language therapist but not to researchers, is to try to make the questionnaire modular. So I think I've got a screenshot. Yeah. So here I've got just the bit of a snapshot of the kind of modules that we've got in the questionnaire. So there is one, background information, just very basic demographic information, date of birth and child's age, who lives in the child's household, whether it's parents or grandparents or whatever. And then we've got, the usual things like, the language exposure and use. We also take an indirect measure of language proficiency, which is especially interesting for the languages that you're not going to be able to assess when you've got very many different languages. And then we get a sense of how varied the activities that children do are in each languages. We also ask parents what they think of their children's languages, their, say, home heritage language, but also the language of the community. Also the extent to which children code switch, because of course we know that, as bilinguals, as multilinguals, code switch is completely normal and part of, what we do. And also we ask, because of course, again, this is a concern that some teachers express, that some sometimes, you know, when they've got a child that is quite new to English, and maybe they're progressing quite slowly, they're never quite sure whether it's just, you know, lack of exposure to the language, or potentially because, you know, bilingual children are as vulnerable, they're monolingual children, to things like developmental language disorder. And sometimes, you know, the profile of, you know, language is quite similar, but of course the causes are very different. So knowing what expectations you can have about a child on the basis of how much language they hear in both of their languages or all of their languages is really important to figure out if there is, you know, potentially an issue there, or is just the fact that this child is just not being exposed to enough language, right? Because say, for example, even when children go to school, and again, you know, I don't want to speak to your situation because I don't know exactly what happens, you know, in Slovenia, but like in the UK, in England, for example, you know, sometimes you got one teacher to 30 children. So, you know, the amount of, even, yes, they're exposed to input, but, you know, they don't have this one-to-one, to and fro conversational turn taking that we know is so conducive to language development. And, you know, inevitably, you know, oftentimes the teacher speaks to the whole class. And if they're lucky, you know, children sometimes get a bit more of a one-to-one with the teachers, or they're exposed obviously to their peers who are themselves language learners. So, you know, all of these things are you know, it's important to find out, you know, whether the child is exposed to the language outside of, you know, the school curriculum, by whom, and in what context, to have a bit more of a, you know, rounded, holistic picture of what their bilingual, multilingual experience is like. Let me see if I can get to the next slide. So yeah, so I would say, you know, that this sort of concludes my brief presentation so far. And again, if you're interested, like I said, I'm happy to share these slides if they're of interest to anyone. And if we're now at the stage in which we're piloting this language questionnaire. We're still very interested to hear what other researchers, what other teachers, whether they think it might be useful potentially. Like I said, at the moment it's going to be used in 3 European countries. I don't know if I would include the UK in Europe. Maybe I kind of do, even if it's, you know, not in Europe in many different ways, but certainly France and the Netherlands still are. And like I said, so we hope that it might be relevant to other colleagues in other countries as well. So it'll be interesting to hear about your experiences as well, and what the situation is like in Slovenia as well. So I think I might stop sharing now.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ludovica. Grazie molte. Yeah, I think it's a great. I mean, you've done a great job with this questionnaire. I mean, it just occurred to me looking at it how you managed to somehow tackle this, or trying to read somehow the complexity of the experiences all these different children have. I mean, we all have, of course, but it's almost so. I mean, this modular system sounds really a great idea, and my question would be: are you going to publish this in a form so everybody can use it as an instrument? Yeah, sure. I mean, at the moment, if you go on the website, there is a manual. There is already, if you can register. For example, if you wanted to pilot it at the moment, so we're also translating it into several different languages. So if people, took a look at this and thought there'd be an interesting thing to use, if you wanted to translate it into Slovenian, for example, because I don't think it's a language that we've got at the moment. It would be really happy to collaborate with anyone on this. So we've got a protocol of translation and back translation. And so in fact, it was very interesting because, we came together from France, the Netherlands, and the UK. And then the minute we started translating, this from English, things come out. Like, for example, in Italian and or in French, you've got, how do you talk to the parent? Is it, the colloquial? In English, you don't have to worry about it. It's always you, right? But in Italian, it's like lei or tu. Is it tu to colloquial, to informal? Is lei, are you putting too much of a distance? These are very different, choices. So this translating the questionnaire has also really refined the way in which we ask the questions that we hadn't quite anticipated. And I think the more we do translations in other languages,
the more we realize, that there are things that we have to be mindful of, that maybe we weren't going from, this kind of, I don't want to say monolingual, but, English, which is such a, a language that hasn't got subtleties that other languages do, that you don't even think about that, right? So, yeah, so that would be.
Well, definitely, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure that there, I'm going to check this and definitely I'm sure there would be some interest in trying to translate and back translate and see the same. Of course, we have the same system, tuvu in Slovene. So
yeah, exactly, right. Yeah. So really thinking, what do you do? It's a hard decision to make. And then, in some languages, people have made slightly different decisions that are not, and we don't impose anything. So, whatever people think. And also the other thing is, I don't think, this questionnaire, it's also to be clear what it is and what it is not. I don't think it's a questionnaire that it's applicable to all multilingual, plurilingual contexts in, everywhere in the world, right? But I think, at least in the kind of, weird, as in Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, countries that we live in, I think it can probably be applicable, because I don't know much about your school system, but I assume that, largely comparable, right, to a lot of other European system, including, the UK one, I guess, you can make certain assumptions, yeah.
I think also it's a great idea to have a measure like this, so that we can really compare and see where we are, because we don't really know where we are until we compare ourselves with the others. So I'm all in favor of using these kind of measures and instruments which can be used also for the purposes of comparing. So
because this is the thing, because when we did, so we've got this sort of one paper published, where we did this systematic review, basically, of what's out there. Even when you ask, the minute you look at these various questionnaire, the way in which you ask how much is your child exposed to, X, Y, and Z, the way, the scale on which, whether it's like a numerical scale, whether it's on a scale using adverbs like, not at all, very often, hardly ever, things like that. Even these things, matter. So, and then the kind of data that you get, you're thinking, how come is often, I don't know, 80%? Can I compare it to this other questionnaire? Is it a sliding scale? Is it, so it's, so for example, we've now sort of, because also it's very difficult to ask parents to do like maths in their head, right? Is it 20%? Is it 80%? So one way in which we ask that is like a visual analog scale. So there is a slider, and they're just dragging the slider across a line. In a kind of magnet and estimating kind of thing. So ways in which you can thinking, and then I think, we think the field is kind of right for, trying to get like a system, like you said, that it's a bit more comparable, so that, you're comparing like with like, right? And these things have happened in other fields, in psychology, in, I don't know, in, where there are metrics. They say, okay, if you're measuring, I don't know, depressive symptoms, people use, I don't know, this scale. If you're using, I don't know, food intake, people use this type of, and we know kind of what it means, right? So you don't have to constantly second guess, right? What is it that they meant when they said that, I think?
So definitely. We've done some research on children's attitudes towards language diversity. And we've also developed a measure, an instrument for which we hope, and the first feedback we get from some researchers is that they're going to use it also to check also the language diversity attitudes in their countries. So we are hoping now to also spread this.
Well, let us know. Yeah, exactly. Because also we'll be collecting sort of data in schools. So, this is also something that could be spread more widely,
exactly.
as this. Yeah.
But it's really hard to make an instrument like this, because you really have to make sure to, put away everything that is not real. So in the end, you end up with something quite raw, I think, or very basic very often, but that's the only way. So
because you need like a kind of minimum common denominator that most people agree with. They think, okay, this is the bare minimum that we want there. Other things would be great, but I don't know if we can. Yeah,
absolutely. So let me just see if anyone has any questions. I don't want to take over too much of this question part. So any questions? Because I have a few, but I want to first ask others to come forward. Theodor has a question. Go ahead.
Thank you. I'm from the University of Maribor. I've done some research, longitudinal research in monolingual child. But my question is actually more about morphological richness. You mentioned that you had a lot of Polish children in this corpus. And my question would be, does morphological richness of the first language have any impact when these children were learning the L2 morphology of English? English is not such a morphologically rich language, but nevertheless, English children have some problems also with their morphology. Was it an advantage to be a speaker of a L1 language with a rich morphology?
Yeah, well, I wish I could answer this question. As you can see, like we had about 43% of children came from a Polish background. So we had, you know, like almost half of the children came from. Our problem was that these children also have a very uneven profile. So some children were very recent arrivals, so which means that they had very good Polish background, right? Because they were basically pretty much monolingual Polish until arriving in the UK. Some were born in England and they had Polish, but also a lot of English. The problem is that we had like a very wide variety of children with very mixed level of Polish skills. Just to say that we didn't have a big enough sample of children with very robust morphology in Polish to say that it would have an effect in English. A lot of the children, for example, that were were growing up in the UK, their Polish was a little bit sketchy. So when it came to, for example, I can also tell you this because at the moment we're doing a project just on Polish English children. So what we're doing, we're taking measures. So, you know, this is the other way to do it, so to speak, you know, rather than going into a class and taking all the languages and not being able to assess what happens, you know, not just in English, the language of schooling, but the other language, we've now taken a different approach. So for these children, we test them on vocabulary, grammar in both English and Polish. And what we're finding, so we're testing children between the ages of 5 and 9, that, for example, things like the case declension system in a lot of these children is quite sketchy. So they still have a lot of, and these are all children, you know, born in the UK. So to give a short answer to your question, unfortunately, we could not test it. I think it'd be a very, if we had a big enough sample, for example, of say children that had been, you know, monolingual Polish until the age of 5 or 6. So, you know, they've got potentially a good, you know, or at least emerging consolidation of their Polish morphology, then you could see, right, if you're comparing them to another children from another language in which they don't have such a morphologically rich language. But unfortunately, we just didn't have enough Polish speaking children with good morphological background to make that case. We wish we had, because we were quite excited, like you, we thought, thinking, oh great, you know, almost half of our sample is from Polish children. But unfortunately, when we started looking, we just didn't have the data to back it up. So it's it's an open question, I guess, but something that we can do a little bit more in this new study, I think. So maybe I'll come back in a year and tell you.
Okay.
Yeah, let's see what happens in a year.
About like something different, but yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. Any other questions? I think it's really interesting to see. I mean, I don't think it's possible to describe the complexity of the background of these children. As you said, I mean, they have different levels of exposure in their own language, in English. So it's a combination. It's incredible that you can. I think it's really impossible almost to describe every little detail of their experience with language, but at least an idea. And I think that the idea that you, when you use the questionnaires with parents, at least you had a start, and you can then relate to.
Yeah, because you know, the way we asked them, said, for example, you know, when you're thinking, you know, some parents, you know, children might, you know, come from a household, they've got other siblings, you know, so for example, comparing them to your, you know, their other siblings, would you say that? And of course, we all know that, right? You know, the more the, you know, the lower down the birth order children are, the less bilingual they are, because inevitably the older children also bring in more of the societal language. So we see these, you know, and it's not an uncommon finding in the families when you've got like, you know, 3 children, maybe the third child is a lot less bilingual than the first child, because the first child was the only one. And then because the, you know, the second and third child are getting more input, more English input from school, right? From the older child that comes home having learned English and will start speaking English more to their siblings, and therefore reducing, right, the amount of, you know, of Polish, for example, that the children get. I don't know. I'm assuming that's, you know, that's a similar thing that you see, right, in your own context.
Oh yes,
I would say, yeah.
Yeah, very similar. I think also the situation here in Slovenia is very similar in terms of the share of children.
Yeah.
But I have another question, and I mean, since your research showed in a way that it's the quality of the input, right, that counts, not so much the quantity in that sense. And so the quality in the sense that it's vocabulary depth and breadth, which is a predictor rather for comprehension, listening comprehension, rather than just being exposed to, if that's how I understood the research. But my question would be, what kind of implications do we see here for language teaching then? I mean, what does it say? I mean, what should we then focus on any special tasks which would you know, develop language, vocabulary and morphology, or?
Yeah, I mean that was my, in another context, I not specifically to do with this project, but like I did quite a lot of work on vocabulary for teachers, and we did actually focus, yes, on the concept of vocabulary depth, because also there is a little bit of this apprehension of like, how many words do children know, right? Which is, okay, well, how big is your vocabulary? But like, how big is your vocabulary? You know, yes, it's a good thing, but actually, how able are you to integrate that? So I think, yeah, that was my take home message, thinking, think about the quality of vocabulary. So when you're teaching a word, think about the many dimensions in which you can teach a word. So for example, reinforcing, you know, orthography, you know, of course, you know, orthography and phonology, really phonological awareness go together. And I guess, you know, in a language like Slovenian, which is less horrendous than English, I mean, I'm assuming, you know, it's a bit like Italian, right? A little bit more, perhaps, you know, the correspondence between letters and sounds.
Yes,
you know?
absolutely.
So it's a little bit more transparent. So there is that. And of course, you know, so you've got that, you know, the side of things. Then, like I said, making connection, you know, with words that are, you know, the synonyms, the antonyms, you know, what is similar to what is, you know, it's basically kind of trying sort of to tap into what our mental lexicon is like, because we know that in our mental lexicon, words are not arranged in an alphabetical order, obviously, right? So we've got semantic neighborhoods, we've got phonological neighborhoods, we've got orthographic neighborhoods, you know, so words that go together along different dimensions clustered together. And then the minute, you know, you're looking for a word, you know, you're also activating a whole cohort of words that, you know, are similar in meaning or similar in, you know, orthography or similar in phonology. So the, you know, the deeper and the wider as well your network is, the more you can tap into that kind of knowledge, right? So for example, just a silly example, like, you know, the popcorn and the cinema. If you know, of course, you know, you can know many things about popcorn, right? How it's made, what it comes out of and stuff like that. But if you can also, you know that popcorn, you know, people typically, I don't know, at least in England, you know, eat popcorn while they go to the cinema, you know, immediately hearing popcorn, you can already create this kind of, evoke like a schema, a model, right? You're just thinking, okay, I can tap into that. And then if you've got this kind of mental model, then a lot of other things can fall into place in that respect, right? Same thing when you're you know, teaching, I don't know, subject specific knowledge, whether it's chemistry or geography, you know, when you're explaining something to do with, I don't know, a new element or a new molecule, you know, the more sort of, you know, elements, you know, the easier it is to understand how certain molecules can come about, for example. So it's really about working on the interconnectedness of and the multidimensionality of what knowing a word really means. You know, it's not just, you know, the mapping of form to meaning in a way, like, you know, doing when you can do fast. But say, for example, if you are, I don't know if you've ever been in an experiment where they're teaching you, I don't know, an artificial language, you know, and they teach you, for example, a new word for a new object, right? And then you do this kind of fast, but you learn nothing about it. You just learn that, I don't know, blink means this thing, and that's it, you know, and you just make, but you know nothing else about it, right? So this is what I mean, is it's just not just collecting tokens, but really making these webs. And then, like I said, you know, in our case, you know, ours is not the only study that has found this, that, you know, then this kind of deep vocabulary knowledge, this morphological awareness has got these effects, right? Because that then allows you to integrate and to make these inferences that are vital, you know, for understanding any text, any conversation, really, because not everything is spelled out.
Yeah, but it makes me think now that this is actually also to do with the cultural exposure, right? Not just linguistic, especially if you mentioned the popcorn.
Yeah.
You know, so it's I can imagine that without the cultural parts,
Yeah.
It would be hard to make this inference, right?
Because also this is another thing, right? Because this happens to bilinguals, whether they're children or adults, right? The other thing that sort of, this is something that we want to look at as well in another study, because we just didn't have the elements. It could be, for example, right, that you've encoded a certain type of experience. So for example, I'm talking about myself. For me, going to the beach is only an Italian experience, right? So I haven't, because, you know, I don't consider English beaches places where you would want to go and lie on the beach. It's way too cold and the sea is just not something, right? So for me, for example, and I'm an adult, like, you know, I've encoded this kind of information. Of course, I'm an adult and of course I can make the transfer, but, you know, through Italian, right? So immediately I can make inferences very quickly, right? When I'm talking beach, I'm thinking sun, hot, Mediterranean, right? But then say if I'm hearing somebody, you know, talking about, I don't know, a Scottish beach, I may, for example, for a minute, you know, just get sidetracked a little bit if somebody talks about, I don't know, a seal, right, that I wouldn't expect to see on an Italian beach. So I think this is also, you're very right, this is part, because it's not just words, but words in context. And some of these things, it's like the way you're encoding the experience, whether you've encoded it through Italian in my case, or through English, or through Slovene, or Russian, or, you know, Italian, may actually make a difference. You're totally right about that. Yeah, this is actually something that we want to explore in a follow-up study. Yeah.
Oh, great.
Very true. Yeah. We didn't have the means to do this in here, but yeah, that would be very, very useful thing to do.
I think it also shows how, you know, language awareness is always connected also with cultural awareness.
Yes,
so it's really hard to make these two apart.
Yeah, I mean, if you're studying, I don't know, something like chemistry, it's something, okay, you know, a molecule is the same, you know, it's H2O wherever you go, right? But other things that are more cultural mediated, that, you know, especially when we're talking about, you know, young children, you know, for example, we decided, for instance, you know, not to have anything to do with Christmas, right, in our stories, because we just thought, could it be that, you know, for some children, we've got a lot of children, like, you know, Muslim children that, you know, fairly recent arrivals, Christmas to them didn't really mean anything, right? And of course, yes, maybe they see it now that they're here, but they hadn't learned about that experience through Arabic, for example. So we just decided to try and stay away from something that was very, but actually then, you know, the other flip side of the things, like you said, is thinking, what if you're doing things that are very culturally specific, you know, in one language as opposed to the other, are you going to get different things? And I predict that, you know, as you pointed out, I think you would, because they are so embedded. Yeah. So
in a way, also the length of time they are exposed. No, they are actually in the environment, in the English environment. In this case, would also probably predict quite a lot in this sense.
Because then you got more opportunities, and, you know, and other things like, you know, how many different speakers, because of course, you know, the more people you interact with, the more you're likely, you know, to hear a different side. Right.
Even the idea of living in England and being exposed to, I don't know, all Christmas rituals and so on. So this is something you cannot escape even just going out on the street. So
you're right. You cannot escape because they're obsessed with Christmas here. That's it.
Yeah, everybody. We are too. I mean, if you come to Slovenia, you will understand. I mean, we have lights everywhere. I mean, it's impossible. It's really. Maybe just one more thing, and then I'll let you go because it's already. If there are no other questions, but I was wondering if, you know, by seeing that that it's the really high level, let's say, input that really counts. It's the, as you said, the morphology, the vocabulary depth and breadth. Aren't we going back to the importance of language awareness in this more traditional way? I mean, that's what I'm seeing now. It's traditional language awareness rather than this, let's say, more modern approach.
Yeah, although these children, I mean, we didn't tap, we didn't give them any measures of metalinguistic awareness as such, right? So these were still tasks that they could do relatively implicitly, because we didn't really ask them to reflect in any meaningful way, right? So there could have been another level in which you can, for example, why is X, the opposite of, we just asked them, like, what is the opposite? And of course, then you can get to another level in which you then say, for example, for the morphological awareness, we just said, here is one horse, here are two horses, yes, you can argue that that's one level of, one lower level of metalinguistic awareness, in the sense that they must have some sort of idea of a rule in their grammar to be able to do that kind of stuff. But we didn't ask them to do any more than that.
Okay.
Interesting that you asked this, because this is something that we're doing with a PhD student of mine. We're actually doing this. So we're getting children to tell us what, not new words that are new to them. They're embedded in stories, and then we ask them if they can figure out what the word means. And some of these words have got complex derivational morphemes, things like, I don't know, now obviously I can't think of any, but like, I don't know, untie, right? So you've got like tie, which is obviously putting, and untie. So you have to know that, like, does thing, destroys things in a way.
Undo,
yeah, exactly. So so to see, and then so it's interesting, and sometimes we ask them to explain why they've given us the answer, and then you can see most of the children sort of, the younger one that tells you because it makes sense, right? So they, so implicitly they know the answer, but they can't tell you why. And other children can tell you, because this word is made up of two words, you can put, two words apart. And for example, you can also say undo, untie, and things like that. So that's like a different level of metalinguistic awareness. For this specific study that I've talked, we didn't tap into that higher level. But I think, metalinguistic awareness is something, right, that, so is also a tool in the box, because especially. Yeah,
it's a great tool. Yeah, and that's also, especially if you see it as in this very broad sense, as talking about language in any way possible. As you said, it makes sense. So just this is already metalinguistic awareness.
Sure.
Oh, great. Yeah. Any other questions, maybe?
It's late for you, right? It's 7:15.
It's 7:15, but it's okay. I mean, it's the same. It's what, 2 hours difference, right?
No, just an hour. No,
just 1 hour. Oh, sorry. Yes, 1 hour. Yes, of course. Yeah. So is it bright still in?
Oh God, no. Now it's dark at like 4 p.m. now. It's like,
okay, so early. Okay, it's also dark here in Slovenia at the moment. So, Ludovica, it was really great to have you with us today.
Thank you
and
so much.
to hear all about the research you are doing. It's great research, and I'm really looking forward to checking the questionnaire and seeing what comes out of the things you are doing now, because these are things that are actually really exciting to all, as we said before, to compare. We can really compare what we are doing and see.
Let's be in touch because, about your own tools. So you can talk offline, and then to see what's coming out of your
oh, definitely. Yeah, we're also waiting now for we have already published this in the Journal of Multilingual Education.
Okay.
The British Journal, and so I can send you the link. But we've now used that instrument in Slovenia on a population of almost 500 children, just to see how it works. So it's something that we're now waiting for the feedback from the journal. But this again, like in your case, I think it's a great thing to see. And I'm definitely going to check the questionnaire now, the modular questionnaire.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, because if there is any interest, it'd be fantastic.
Oh yes.
In translation and adaptation.
Okay. Yeah, great. Absolutely. Okay. So thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. And goodbye to everyone. Good night.
Bye. Thank you for staying. Thank you very much. Good night.
Good night.
Bye. Thank you.